Hi, my name is Eva Steiner, and this is my project Psychotherapists Around the Globe. I am interviewing the psychotherapists around the world and asking them the same 8 questions. I am wondering how mental health profession is in their country. Today we are going to... Thank you for doing this interview with me. Before we start, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Thank you for having me, Eva. I feel much privileged to do this interview with you. So, I'm Ishani Karyavasam, originally from Sri Lanka. I've been deeply involved in academia and applied psychology for the past 6 years, focusing primarily on adolescents and youth. And my work mostly encompasses various facets, especially including teaching, research, counseling, and also other practical applications of psychology. I have this keen interest in counseling and with specialization to grief, pain, and also working with women. Through my experience, I'm trying to bridge the gap between academic knowledge and real world applications. So trying to, create an impact in the lives of individuals, especially these adolescents and youth group that I'm working with, and help whoever navigating through challenging life situations.
Tell me a little bit about your culture. What is some holiday or tradition that your country celebrates? And if your culture would be an emotion, what emotion would it be?
Sri Lanka has, the culture is very diverse cultures, traditions, and religions, but majority being the Buddhists. But then there are Muslims, Tamils. There are many other religions as well. So significantly, if I take a cultural festival, Sinhala and Tamil New Year, which we celebrate in April, it's one of the major festivals that we celebrate in Sri Lanka, especially celebrated by Sinhalese, Buddhists, and Tamils, but also minority Muslims. As a minority, they celebrate certain things like Ramadan, Hajj festival, and other things as well. And there are so many other Buddhist religious festivals as well which we celebrate. Especially, why I chose this New Year, because it's a time where all the families come together, celebrate, and then there are a lot of traditional things that we do. There are various rituals, certain family traditions. We prepare special food items and stuff like that. So the second part of the question, I think, if Sri Lankan culture was an emotion, I would say then it would be a blend of warmth and resilience, right? The warmth here, as in, I'm referring to the hospitality of Sri Lankans, friendliness, and then strong sense of community. So those are characteristics of the Sri Lankan society, especially being an Asian country and belonging to collectivist culture. They're very friendly, hospitable, and there are special family traditions of us. Why I would say resilience on the other hand, because we have been having a lot of issues. There were periods of conflicts, natural disasters, but throughout Sri Lankans have been consistently demonstrating resilience, adaptability, and also strong sense of perseverance. So as an emotion, I would say it's a blend of kind of warmth and resilience, Eva.
How did you become a psychotherapist in your country, and what is your therapeutic approach?
Well, my journey of becoming a psychotherapist started with passion for understanding human behavior, and I started learning psychology. The starting point, I was mostly into academia even now, because I believe teaching is my cup of tea. So initially, I completed my undergraduate studies, and then I pursued my postgraduate in psychology, and then I also pursued my master's in psychology with a specialization on clinical and counseling aspect. So with my master's qualification, I started my practice. So here, having a PhD is not necessary for you to practice as a psychotherapist, but with up to your master's education, you can start practicing. So that's how I became a psychotherapist. And my approach, I would say, it's mostly integrative, Eva. So because I do not think in Sri Lanka, I can stick to just one particular approach or one particular theoretical framework. So I would mostly go into integrative therapies, where I would combine approaches, such as CBT, psychodynamic therapy, and mindfulness based interventions, and also positive psychological interventions. So, and also a little bit of humanistic approach as well. So I would integrate depending on the client and depending on the situation.
In general, do you need a psychology degree in Sri Lanka to become a psychotherapist, or there are any other way you can work with people?
You got to start with psychology, studying psychology in Sri Lanka at the moment, and after that only you can move on to counseling or psychotherapy as I would say a specialization.
And specialization, do you have any type of approach? I don't know, like a clinical psychology, counseling. So after the bachelor, do you need to specialize in clinical psychology to be allowed to work as a therapist, or you can have, I don't know, organizational psychology?
Yes, like that. There is clinical counseling, organizational, child. There are various things that you can specialize on, and depending on your specialization, you can continue to work. And I would say people who would specialize in clinical, they work as clinical psychologists, and people who are into counseling aspects, they mostly take the route of being psychotherapists and counselors. And people who do applied psychology, they're the people mostly into academia in Sri Lanka.
And with the psychotherapeutic approaches, are there many schools in Sri Lanka, or you need to train elsewhere?
Unfortunately, no, there are not many schools to train. There are very few places, very few universities that offer and cater psychology. But with some foreign affiliations, some of the private institutions have also started offering psychology, and psychology is being very demanding right now in Sri Lanka.
And the psychotherapy approach, like psychodynamic, gestalt, humanistic, do you learn that in the psychology studies, or do you have a special training course for that type of approaches?
Well, it depends on the program that mostly these universities offer. And especially, if you take this counseling module, let's say during your postgraduate or master's level, pretty much all these approaches would be covered.
How society looks upon psychotherapy or any psychological help?
It's evolving. I'm very happy to say it's evolving because it wasn't what was there a decade ago, right? And it's really growing, and there is recognition, and there are a lot of awareness campaigns about where people talk about the importance of mental health. But I must still admit there are still some stigma when seeking professional help for psychological issues. But however, these lot of awareness campaigns and a lot of advocacy effects, right, efforts, they're gradually shifting societal attitude more into accepting and understanding psychology, counseling, and psychotherapeutic interventions.
And what do you think created this shift?
I would say mostly the awareness campaigns, and then universities, state and private universities, both started offering psychology. Now, new students enrolling in these programs, and all these things I think are created. And also there are the various medias, right? So the social media started talking about the importance of mental health, and also actually recognizing certain very crucial issues like postpartum depression, and they were the things that you cannot hide.
Mm-hmm. And how it was 10 years ago, before the shift?
The services were available before the shift, but people were, I would say, very reluctantly to meet a psychotherapist, to meet a psychologist, because we belong to a collectivist culture where the self concept was not really promoted. We were taught to look at the unity, the family, the close group, and then most of the problems were therefore resolved within that unit. And our people will not really go and discuss their issues with a third person, and they really did not have the knowledge that there are professional services available until recently. An old person in the family would intervene, or a knowledgeable person in the family would intervene, or a priest in the temple would intervene when people had problems. But now, of course, there are many programs have been offered. There are people pursuing to their PhD level in psychology, and people have started their professional practice, and also sometimes doctors. But we did not have that problem with psychiatry. There were psychiatrists, but the only problem was with counselors and psychotherapists. But now, kind of doctors, psychiatrists also working with the therapists, they collaborate so that people now more than ever they are moving towards it.
Interesting. So they were okay to go to psychiatric, but they were reluctant towards psychology, psychotherapy. How come?
Exactly, because our people would believe more in doctors, and they would believe more in medicine rather than working on their internal emotions or working on their internal issues. So, they would think the medicine can fix it faster and better. Mainly, I would say, this is due to the unawareness, and it was not very popular. And, the urbans would still, they know better than the rurals, right? Rurals still do not have a very good understanding about it. But I hope things will be better in the coming days.
And what was the mental health stigma, or still is?
Look, that yes, crazy is one thing that they would use. People who would seek counseling or psychotherapy, or who would go and meet a psychologist. And until very recently, other than, very few disorders such as depression and anxiety, I think people knew about it. But other than that, there are so many other disorders that people suffer, and people really did not have any idea about it. And rather than going for and seeking professional support, they would try other alternative methods, certain like religious interventions, right? Go and, meeting the temple free priest and see whether they can do any other alternative methods. Another reason also, actually, therapy is costly in Sri Lanka. And this is something, this is not like that you go to the doctor and, get some medicine prescribed. So this is a continuous approach where you have to continue your therapy, and it is costly. So the cost is also, I think, one of the problems why people are reluctant. And as I told you, we have this habit of managing or resolving our conflict among ourselves. So it was not the practice to go and speak about your problems with a third party, and especially a total stranger. And that was kind of a stigma. And especially the gender wise also, right? The masculine traits did not really allow men to go and meet. But all these things are now changing. But earlier days, it was like, it's not the man's thing to seek therapy. A man has to be, always very tough and bold and brave.
And you mentioned priests, and maybe turning to them. So what kind of methods do they use? Because I know at least we in the West borrow some practices.
Yes, mindfulness and listening to sermons, and religious form of, advising, trying to, sort of cultivate those religious practices depending on their religion. And mindfulness practices are mostly coming in Buddhism. I don't really think that it's coming in other religions. But mainly, prayers, right? Sometimes, parents would encourage the children to pray no matter what, so that the gods will look after your problems, things like that. But then when it comes to Buddhist families, parents will mostly try to intervene, and then sending them to learn the religion, prayers, engaging in traditional practices. Sometimes, they will think that certain problems will vanish or diminish if children engage in meritorious activities, so that their mind will not go astray.
What is your society teaching about child-parent relationship, and whether these values of society also influence how you design your interventions as a therapist?
I think Sri Lanka, once again, emphasizing the fact that we are a collectivist culture. So we place a strong emphasis on family bonds, and we respect for elders. So child parent relationship is, I would say, it's central part of person's identity and well-being. Even after the marriage, not up until the child's marriage, but even after that, parents will be still involved in their life. Parents are looked after during their old ages. Very rarely they would send them to orphanages. So there are a lot of cultural values, and also when designing interventions. Because even when we design tailor certain interventions, we really look at the importance of that communication, respect, and understanding intergenerational approaches, communication within the family unit. So maybe this is not the case for everyone, but I would say for majority. And the child parent relationship is, it's very crucial. And I think that basically shapes the child's behavior, the attitudes, the values, their qualities, not only for one particular generation, but what child learns within the family is usually passed off to the offsprings as well. So when designing interventions also, it's a crucial fact as a therapist that, we would deeply look into the family relationships, because if the family relationships, let's say for an example, during the childhood was not so strong, and that particular individual may weave that as a very negative impact for his entire life, because the majority of us would strongly emphasize on the importance of child parent relationship. And a single parenting, divorces are not, even though these things happening, those are inevitable, but these are not still strongly encouraged in the Sri Lankan culture.
And in case you need to get a divorce or you are a single parent for various reasons, how does society look at you?
So even let's say that a couple getting a divorce due to a marital conflict, but the society will strongly believe that it has a huge impact on children, which is true. But then they would believe, right, even if the family bond is toxic between parents, it is better that you still live together for the well-being of the children. And they really do not focus on the damage that it can create, right? When parents being unhappy, there can be a strong impact on children, but our culture wouldn't focus on that. Instead, they would always believe, no matter how bad it is, no matter how toxic it is, it's always good, when the child has the both parents. So that is, I think that thinking has to change, because broken families, constant arguments, unhappy parents create broken children. I mean, this is my, very personal, very subjective, but if you speak to another person, there can be a complete different idea.
And if we are focused solely on toxic relationship between the parents, let's say, so how do you approach that as a therapist, where there is a huge cultural value to stay together for children?
It is tough because, let's say, when there is a marital conflict between the couple, it's not just the couple or the children or that family. The entire family is involved in most of the cases. The husband's parents, the wife's parents. So, like, many people are involved, and sometimes making it aggravated also. And people really struggle not being able to take a firm decision due to some of these very strong cultural values. Even though they know that for a fact this marriage is consuming them, sometimes it is not really giving them any happiness, and it gives a very negative impact on the children, but they sometimes think that it is essential that they have to be in this marriage for the sake of children, so that they really do not understand the damage that it can do to not just the children but for them as well. And the happiness is as a component is not really valued in such settings, because we were always taught to prioritize other person's happiness, right? As children, we have to think about the parents, and we are never to sabotage that. And then as parents, your focus is mainly going to the children. So as people, as an individual, so it is essential, as I believe, that as a person that you have to be happy, because I strongly believe that you cannot pour from an empty cup. But the idea of self is not really promoted in countries like ours. So our people still struggle to understand concepts such as, self-concept, self-confidence, self-esteem, things like that, because the focus is always given to the group and the community. But I think once the rapport building is done, and when you understand the priorities of the family and the well-being of the children, well-being of those individuals, you can come into a certain awareness. You can intervene as a therapist. Me personally, as a therapist, I always try to prioritize what they want out of the relationship. So I usually have a talk and see what is their view and what do they want as a person, what do they want for their partner and for the child. And from that onwards, I will try to build the connection.
What are the learned beliefs regarding client-therapist relationship, and can the relationship continue outside the therapy once the therapy process is over?
Well, in Sri Lanka, of course, there is this belief that the importance of establishing a trusting and respectful relationship between the client and the therapist. So, the rapport building is essential if you want to maintain an effective therapeutic process. But, however, this relationship is typically confined to the therapeutic setting according to books. But I would say some clients may choose to maintain the contacts with their therapist outside sessions also, sometimes, for additional support or guidance. Since there are no strict rules about it, I think it's completely up to the therapist to decide how they can do that, in a professional and an ethical manner.
And you mentioned there are no strict rules about it. Is there any law about psychology or even psychotherapy in Sri Lanka?
No, not necessarily, but there are very few people practice at the moment. I would say handful of qualified people. But we abide by ethics, so I think that is how we all started. So there are no such strict rules, and there are very few regulatory bodies as well. But as I know, most of our colleagues, we abide by those ethics. It's like this, Eva, right? You violate one or two, there's nobody to sue you here. But I have not really seen that happening because we always practice with ethics.
And how many of you are there?
Yeah, I would say not even 50 practicing psychologists.
So it's really at the start.
Yes, it is.
And how do you get help as a patient, as a client? Through private pay or then through the public hospital? So how is the system established?
We don't have psychologists in the government hospitals, state hospitals. So the help of psychologist only available in private. And in private hospitals, it's 100% private practice. There are few like non-governmental organizations that may recruit counselors and psychotherapists and offer that for free. But we do not have psychotherapists or counselors in our hospitals. That is sad. But in private settings, yes. All the private hospitals, there are even residential psychologists, psychotherapists, so that you can get the help. And mostly the clients have to pay.
Do you have a waiting list, let's say?
No, there are psychiatrists as well. So we do it like a collaborative approach sometimes. Not much of a waiting list because still not many people coming or seeking help. It is still the minority, seeking therapy. And now, of course, it is emerging, it is flourishing, it's thriving. So many people now, coming into the profession. There are freshers as well and working with senior people. So I think in the next few years we can expect that numbers will increase. And there are very few, I think, telehealth applications as well where you can get online counseling therapy as well. And there are 2 to 3 other interventions as well, like where there are hotlines like suicidal hotlines, and then there's the thing called CCC hotline, and there are a few other non-governmental organizations, so that you can speak to those hotlines anytime in any situation, so that they would offer the telecounseling for free of charge.
And is supervision a must for a therapist in your country?
I wouldn't say it's a must in my country, but it is considered as a standard practice for all the therapists in Sri Lanka, because that is what we were taught and that is what we are practicing. I think it is essential because I personally believe, right, the therapists have to reflect on their clinical work and they have to receive feedback. And also, they have to ensure that all these ethical standards are met and maintained. So, supervision also supports you, and especially for less experienced therapists. So I would always encourage and tell and advise my juniors always to practice with the therapists. I think it's a standard practice, but there can be a few who are practicing without supervision as well.
What are the most common complaints that a client comes to therapy for?
I think depression, anxiety, relationship issues, and stress related disorders, OCD, also trauma related other disorders as well. Sometimes adjustment difficulties. So, those are very common. Trauma related grief, identity issues, also prevalent concerns, but not very common.
And can you tell me more about grief and trauma?
Trauma, I would say, let's say you being in a toxic relationship for years and not being able to come out of it, and trauma bonding relationships, and where you think that you have no other option other than being in it. Learned helplessness is something that I commonly see in most of these people. and also people who have been abused during their childhood, now as adolescents, now that trauma, that unable to deal with that trauma, that it keeps disturbing their mental peace. And grief when you lose people, just over death, but sometimes also, I think I told you, mentioned once, that the divorce and things are still not really encouraged. So not just death, but also things like divorce, relationship breakup, are incidents where people are unable to cope up with their grief, and can escalate to a point where people even consider committing suicide. So grief is something that we have to handle meticulously. So fortunately, mostly people, when they're unable to cope up or handle their grief, they seek professional support.
And if you would share one tool, belief, or approach that is a must have for you as a therapist, what would that be?
Empathy, empathy, and empathy. So I think it's the cornerstone of my therapeutic approach, and I cultivating empathy allows me to deeply connect with my clients, and it helps me to my rapport building throughout the sessions, and understand their experiences, be compassionate about them. So I think empathy is also the foundation for building trust, and it foster growth. Not just as a therapist, I think empathy is something that we all need as a community. So